Fireworks in the U.S. Senate last night as Democrats put up a fight against some of President Donald Trump's most controversial cabinet nominees. Aren't they all controversial? In a stunning move last night, Republicans voted to bar Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren from speaking on the Senate floor while she was quoting a 1986 letter by the late Coretta Scott King that criticized Attorney General nominee Jeff Sessions' civil rights record. At the time, Sessions had been up for a federal judgeship. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell accused Warren of impugning the motives and conduct of the Alabama senator and called for Warren to be silenced. But the Massachusetts Democrat refused to back down.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
The senators impugn the motives and conduct of our colleague from Alabama as warned by the chair. Senator Warren, quote, said Senator Sessions has used the awesome power of his office to chill the free exercise of the vote by black citizens. I call the senator to order under the provisions of Rule 19.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I am surprised that the words of Coretta Scott King are not suitable for debate in the United States Senate. I ask leave of the Senate to continue my remarks.
Is there objection?
Object.
I appeal the ruling.
Objection is heard. The senator will take her seat.
The Senate is scheduled to vote on Senator Sessions' nomination later today. Last night's move means Senator Warren won't be able to speak on the floor of the Senate until after the debate on Sessions is closed. Senator Warren commented on the incident via Twitter. She tweeted, "I will not be silent while the Republicans rubber stamp an AG who will never stand up to the president when he breaks the law." She also tweeted, "Tonight, Leader Mitch McConnell silenced Mrs. King's voice on the Senate floor, and millions who are afraid and appalled by what's happening in our country." Joining us to talk about all this is Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia. He is the top Democrat on the House Education and the Workforce Committee. Wow. What do we say to these things? Mitch McConnell basically has said to Senator Warren, go in the corner and sit down.
That episode was so bizarre on so many different levels. First of all, you're silencing one of the leading liberal voices in the country on an issue involving the nomination of the Attorney General. How can the one who is supposed to protect civil rights, how can the words of Coretta Scott King be out of order? I mean, just on all levels, to have the rule actually says you can't say, essentially you can't say anything bad about another senator. If he is up for a nomination, how can you restrict the comments to only nice things about him? How are you going to have a debate on his nomination if you can't have the good and the bad? It's just so bizarre on many levels, and so if they're going to force his nomination through and limit the debate and restrict only good things to be said about him, it's just bizarre to call that a debate at all.
Well, many people hadn't even heard of this rule, Rule 19, probably before last night, but what seems clear to me as an attorney is that this rule is meant to maintain decorum between senators when they're engaged in debate so that the debate doesn't devolve into name-calling, etc. It's not, and I don't think the founders even intended when they were writing this, whoever drafted this decorum rule, that when you agree to put your name in for a nomination for an appointment to a cabinet, that then your record can't be questioned, which is basically what was being done through Mrs. King's letter.
And that's why it is so bizarre that you're going to have a debate on the fitness of a person to hold an office, and you can't say anything bad about him. You can only say good things. I mean, it's just silly. I mean, if you go back, and I'm sure some things were said about Senator Tower. I think maybe he might have been a former senator, but you cannot have a coherent debate if you can't say anything negative about the senator. Invoking that rule was just meant to silence the Senator Warren. She was making an effective point, and they just wanted to silence her. And it is for the Attorney General, one who is supposed to be protecting your First Amendment rights, to silence someone in violation of the spirit of the First Amendment. I guess you got certain liberties on the Florida Senate. But how can you limit someone's freedom of speech when they're talking about a nomination and you're supposed to be having a debate and you can only say good things about the candidate? You want to restrict the debate for your candidate. You can only say good things about the candidate. That's just...
Well, this is another example.
That's just bizarre, particularly for the position of Attorney General.
Right, which is one of the most critical appointments ever. I want to bring in the rest of my panel. Joining us today, we have Dr. Greg Carr, Chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, HU, and Clint Smith, the author of Counting Dissent. Look, Dr. Greg, just as a black woman in America, I take personal exception to the notion that they would choose to shut down Coretta King's letter, a letter that, if truth be told, decades ago,
that's right,
Strom Thurmond chose to not put in the record. So this woman's voice was quashed then, and now coming through another woman, one of the most powerful women in the country. She's bringing it into the record after it was already brought out in committee, and Mitch McConnell says go sit in a corner.
Well, Counselor, you should be offended. We should all be offended, as Congressman Scott says. I mean, you know, Marimba Ani, the sociologist, refers to this as the rhetorical ethic. That's why every debate in Congress begins with "my friend." We all know you don't mean it. But, you know, what we saw yesterday was Colonel McConnell rising in Kentucky as a strain of Dixie played in his head, had to defend the honor of his fellow Confederate, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, against a black woman from Marion, Alabama. This is Coretta Scott King. It wasn't even about Elizabeth Warren, although it was in terms of the politics, as the Congressman has said. But the bigger issue is here, she was reading from that letter. And so what you see is, you know, it is very interesting. You know, I seem to remember a caustic junior senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, who called Mitch McConnell a liar on the floor of the United States Senate, and he didn't invoke Rule 19 for him. So what you see here is not only a double standard, but a triple standard. And you should be offended, Counselor, because Coretta Scott King's words are truer now than they were when she wrote them 31 years ago.
But isn't it amazing? So what he does, and for whatever the reasons were that he decided he wanted to silence it, of course what it did is amplify. It amplified her letter. It empowered Warren. I was up last night and Rachel Maddow had her on immediately, and then she took to Facebook over 1.5 million views now of her reading the entire letter. So what do you make of this? I mean, was this a successful ploy on the part of the Republicans, or are we now back again with a groundswell from the public?
It was a strange move because Mitch McConnell is often sort of espoused as this sort of master of understanding the rules of the Senate and how to sort of manipulate them in an effective manner. But this was a strange decision, both in part because silencing Coretta Scott King sort of runs counter to any notion of decorum, so to speak, that we understand, but also that it is seemingly going to create a sort of groundswell of support for Elizabeth Warren. And as you said, one of the people who's the most important and progressive voices in this country, and bring attention to something that was happening that many people otherwise simply wouldn't have been paying attention to. And I think the irony is also that in those 40-some-odd senators who sort of signed on with support and voted alongside Mitch McConnell to silence Coretta Scott King's letter, and what she was saying is that so many of those people, I'm sure if you went back a few weeks ago, were celebrating the life and legacy, or their notion of the legacy of Martin Luther King, right? And so it goes to show you the ways in which, especially folks on the right, will sort of render a caricature of Dr. King and not reckon with the sort of totality of his legacy and the totality of what he and both Coretta stood for. And I think that this is a prime example of that happening.
Right, and this is an example, again, about people not really wanting to give full voice to her legacy and the legacy of many women of the civil rights movement. But Congressman Scott, I need to talk about Mitch McConnell for a minute. This is not the first blatant power grab we've seen from him. I'm reminded of a certain time for the full of last year when he flat out refused to call for a vote to even have hearings on Jeff Garland's nomination for the Supreme Court, or Merrick Garland's nomination for the Supreme Court. And now we're seeing the same thing with Jeff Sessions, him pushing through what he wants to push through, holding what he wants to hold, telling people to sit down when he wants them to sit down. What's going on?
The Merrick Garland situation, I think, should not be ignored, because if you look at the three branches of government, the Supreme Court is constituted by appointments from presidents. And so if you win the presidency, you can affect the Supreme Court. What happened last year was that an appointment that should have been made by a Democratic president was stonewalled. Essentially stolen, and one of the senators said stolen, and a Republican will get that appointment. Now, well, if you go back 24 years, 8 with Clinton, Bush, and Obama, 16 of the 24 years, Democrats have been in control. So you'd think only one person was appointed before that. All of them, you would think that just the ordinary rotation, that we would have a majority of the court. And that would have been the 5th Democratic appointment. And now it's going to be a Republican appointment. I mean, you're talking about the ability to enforce voting rights and all of the things that the Supreme Court considers. How do you just ignore the fact that a Democrat was supposed to get the appointment? And there was no, they say, well, you don't do this in an election year. It's never happened in an election year. I haven't found, I looked back, I couldn't find a vacancy in an election year. People don't retire in an election year. Nobody died during an election year, maybe for the last 50 years. So every time there's been a vacancy in an election year, it's been filled.
Right.
Well, because there hadn't been one.
Right, and I think in all of our history, there's only been one at a time.
But you just can't ignore the fact that the normal course has been disrupted by an outrageous. There's plenty of time. I mean, there was plenty of time to go through an appointment. The Kennedy was appointed, was confirmed during an election year.
That's right.
Now, you had Bork appointed and defeated. Ginsburg was the Harvard Law professor, was appointed and withdrew, and then they appointed Kennedy. You did all of that. You had enough time to do all of that and still have them in place by the first Monday in October, beginning of this Supreme Court session. So there's no time problem.
Well,
look, it usually takes about 3 months.
It was the same as last night, a direct disrespect for last night, Warren's ability to speak on the floor, for President Obama, really a direct disrespect of his right. And they said, let's let the voters decide. But, you know, it's obvious. The voters elected the president, and it was up to the president to decide. What I don't want to get missed, though, Dr. Gregg, is they blocked the nomination last year. Mm-hmm. So then we end up with this conservative nominee for Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And we add to that Jeff Sessions for Attorney General.
Sure.
When we've got people wanting to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Of course.
We've got people wanting to basically pull down every gain that civil rights movement has taken in the past 10 years if they can get a hold to it. Never mind issues on voting. Talk to me about the politics that's involved and what we can do to stop it, because it seems that we're out of power.
Well, that's the focus. I think, you know, the Democrats are going to have to decide whether they want to fight or not. The Republicans are trying to hold on to not just political power, but a way of life. Mitch McConnell has been rather feckless and ghoulish in this. When the president was elected, as we know, he said, it's my job to make him a one-term senator. What he did with the Supreme Court nomination is utterly indefensible if we're talking about fairness in politics, as Congressman Scott is talking about. But if we're talking about naked power, it's absolutely defensible. You know, people got caught up in 2 senators from the Republican Party defecting on the Betsy DeVos nomination. They didn't defect. The Republican Party can count. They knew Smiling Mike Pence was going to come down and break that tie. 2 of them might defect because the Senate has been in session all night, last night and the night before. 2 of them might defect on Jeff Sessions to save face. And then we get caught up in, oh, can we get one more person? No, you can't. Don't you know that Olympia Snow and then went over and talked to them and said, we're going to go over to make it look like we're being reasonable. You got to listen to Chuck Grassley yesterday talking about Jeff Sessions. You got to listen to Orrin Hatch come up and say, oh, I lament the lack of decorum in the Senate. That's all theater. This is about naked politics. And Congressman Scott has been fighting for years. His colleagues in the Congress, now in the Senate, the Democrats are going to have to decide whether they're going to play the same kind of hardball the Republicans are. Otherwise, we are going to have to abandon both parties and run to have some political power on our own.
Kickstart your day at 7 and get the news you need from the perspective you want. NewsOne Now with Roland Martin. Every weekday morning at 7 on TV 1.